Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Reinout de Vries. He's Associate Professor at the VU University Amsterdam and Full Professor at the University of Twente. Together with researchers like Michael Ashton and Kibeom, he has worked on the HEXACO model of personality. His main research interests are in the areas of personality, communication styles, and leadership. Recent work has focused on the construction of a six-dimensional communication styles inventory, CSI, a brief HEXACO personality inventory, BHI, the relation between impression management and overclaiming, and HEXACO personality, and on the relation between self and other rated HEXACO personality on the one hand, and leadership, proactivity, impression management, and overclaiming on the other. So, Dr. De Vries, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. And by the way, sorry for butchering the pronunciation of your name, but
No, that's fine. You're doing great.
okay, great. So, I've already had a couple of, or more than a couple of personality psychologists on the show, and some prominent ones like Dr. Louis Goldberg and Gerard Saussure and others. So, the thing, I guess, about human personality is that we have one inventory, the big five, that I think is the most prominent nowadays, but then there's also other inventories, and the different inventories have their own limitations, right?
Right, yes. Yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. You want to me to to say what kind of limitations?
Yeah, maybe because since you're working on the hexaco and it has an extra dimension when compared to the big five,
Yeah.
right? Maybe you would like to comment on why maybe you're doing that and in what ways you think the big five is limited.
Okay. Well, some of the guests probably already commented on that. If you had Ja Sachet on the show as well, and Goldberg are notable lexical researchers. And they've probably already discussed with you the fact that had the main personality dimensions that people have uncovered are based on psycholexical research. And of course, the biggest, most well-known one is indeed the Big Five, popularized after 1990, based on Lou Goldberg's work, although those dimensions were known before that. And also popularized, of course, by the Neo PIR, the Neo Personality Inventory Revised, which builds also on the big five dimensions and is almost equivalent. And you probably know, maybe Saussure told already that lexical studies after one conducted by Goldberg have noted that in all of the languages that were investigated, you find a sixth factor that's common across multiple languages. So when at one point in time, Kibeom was a PhD student together with Kibeom together with Mike Ashton, and they were discussing doing a lexical study in Korea, where Kibeom is from. And because it hadn't been conducted in the East, and they thought they would uncover the Big Five, but then, and indeed they did a variant of that. But when they looked further, they found a sixth dimension, which is now called honesty, humility, and they said, "Hey, this is a very clear dimension. Let's take a look at other data sets." And do we find that similar dimension? And lo and behold, if they looked at the articles that had appeared already, they found in each one of them, it was mentioned that there was an additional dimension. And so they started collecting all this data. And when they did, and that's where I came in, I worked together with Kibeom in Australia at that time in the beginning of 2000. And I got the Dutch lexical data set. We found that in all of these data sets, there were actually 6 and not more than 6 cross-culturally replicable dimensions of personality. And that's, in fact, the major start of the HEXACO model. And in paper 2004, although had Kibeom and Mike already published on HEXACO model or the 6 dimensions before that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And do you know if the HEXACO model of personality is more universal than the Big Five in terms of applying in more cultures than the Big Five, or not?
Well, I wouldn't say that. What the HEXACO model is the largest space of personality dimensions that is cross-culturally replicable. So you can say that you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 dimensions. If you look at the largest space, you find it's impossible to find dimensions of personality that are cross-culturally replicable and that have a reasonable size, that are just not one tiny facet. So you can say something that's better replicable. It's more that you find in all of these countries where you do this research, you find that this is the largest space that you can replicate.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
So it's more optimal than a Big Five in the sense that if you leave out this dimension, you miss out on an important dimension of personality, individual variation. And of course, honesty, humility is an incredibly important dimensions for explaining all sorts of behavior.
Mm-hmm. So the HEXACO has the 6th extra dimension of honesty, humility in comparison with the Big Five. Are there any other major differences between the inventories or not?
Yeah, so if you look at the Big Five and its different variants, you have to realize, and I would like to say also to your listeners that always check out which inventory you're using of the Big Five, because there are also some notable differences between some of those inventories, and sometimes even main dimensions don't correlate really highly. So it's important to find out what exactly is being measured by Big Five inventory. There are multiple. There are many more than HEXACO instruments. The most notable difference is indeed the honesty-humility dimension. One should realize also that when comparing to the Big Five, it captures some of the variance of agreeableness from the Big Five. And in some inventories, such as the NEO, you'll find that those capture more variance of honesty, humility than other inventories. But most of the honesty, humility has unique variance, which is not captured by any of the agreeableness domain skills in other inventories. But there are also two other notable differences. And that is that agreeableness and emotionality in the HEXACO model are rotated variants of Big Five agreeableness and emotional stability. And that is that if you look at agreeableness in the HEXACO model, for instance, it contains an irritability component, like anger, which is normally associated with neuroticism, or reverse emotional stability in the Big Five or the 5-factor model. So if you think about the concept of neuroticism, it doesn't only contain things like anxiety and fearfulness, but also irritability. So it captures emotions, negative emotions, whereas the emotions associated with anxiety are indeed in emotionality in the HEXACO model, but emotions associated with irritability and hostility are in agreeableness in the HEXACO model and not in neuroticism. And then there's another difference, slight difference, that sentimentality, which is part of agreeableness in the Big Five model, has shifted its position, so it's part of emotionality in the HEXACO model. So so emotionality is actually more neutral with respect to social desirability, because it not only contains anxiety and fearfulness components, but it also contains sentimentality and dependence. And sentimentality is more positively evaluated normally. So I actually like the HEXACO model much better also because of this perspective, that it has this emotionality that's more neutral in terms of social desirability. Neuroticism is most of the time very negatively evaluated.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the Big Five, there's the dimensions, the facets. There are people that also studied the aspects, that is, they subdivided each dimension into two different aspects, like, for example, Colin D. Young, he has done that type of work. I mean, when it comes to the HEXACO model, does it also have that kind of hierarchy or not?
Yeah. So the HEXACO model has on the highest level the 6 domain skills, and then for each of the domain skills it has 4 facets, and of course the facets are made up again of a number of items. So generally, in terms of personality hierarchy, I think those 6 dimensions are on the top level of the hierarchy. There are a few people that disagree with the big 2 and the big 1, or the general factor of personality. But I think there's sufficient evidence to say that that position is untenable, but that's a different discussion. And I think if you go below, you have facet levels, and the facets are more, specific, focused elements of personality. And you find that the facets in the HEXACO model of personality, in one domain they correlate about 0.4, 0.5, and they make up one domain skill if they're put together. But next to facets, and that's also interesting, you could also contextualize skills. So below facets, you'll find actually contextualized behaviors, so maybe contextualized facets, and then the specific behaviors. So I would generally say there are 4 levels of personality. So one had domain level, a facet level, a contextualized facet level, and then the very specific narrow behaviors that have to do with context. And a context would be done something like, for instance, a work context, or a leadership context, or a school context, or a home context. And you can, of course, have specific items for each of these contexts and specific behaviors that you exhibit in these contexts. And you can put for each context, you can make, of course, then contextualize also domain skills. So, to make it complicated, you would have sort of 2 hierarchies. You have domains, contextualized domains, and then contextualized facets, and then behaviors, or you have domains and then facets, and then contextualized facets and items. That would be my position, but maybe it's a bit complicated for the listener.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let me just ask you this. What is your main goal with studying the HEXACO model of personality? I mean, are you trying to capture the most important aspects of human personality, the ones, for example, that people care the most about? Or are you trying to create a model of personality that has specific applications, like for example applications at the clinical level, at the workplace level, or things like that?
Yeah, I think the applications are multiple, and I have not one specific application in mind. Although I tend to, but not only do research also in a work context, but not only. Um, so for me, the interesting part is, of course, yeah, what is the optimal description of personality? We've had this big discussion, and some of it's still going on. And of course, HEXACO, we still had not the questionnaire that's most often used. And of course, we think that it's more optimal than a Big Five model. So there is a discussion. So a structured discussion. You have, of course, the discussion about the explanation of personality. This is the whole discussion about genes and environment, and genes in environment, and the activation of traits, and had childhood development of traits and adult developments of traits, and whether you can change traits and change your personality. And then you have the discussion about the effects of personality. So, what kind of effects do personality traits have on important life outcomes in the work context, in the personal context, relationships, happiness, well-being, life expectancy, etc., etc. So there are a huge number of questions to be answered, and I tend to like most of these topics.
Okay, so I mean, in other interviews, I've already talked with people about some of the limitations of studying human personality, like, for example, the fact that the Big Five and other models are based on the lexical hypothesis, and that has some limitations associated with it, and other things. Other limitations have to do, for example, with the fact that many of the work that is done is based on questionnaires or surveys that people reply to and things like that, and then people gather huge quantities of data for them to arrive at the dimensions and the facets and things like that. In the case of the Hexaco, are there other more objective, let's say, approaches that you have to determine the different dimensions and things like that?
Yeah, well, of course, this is a discussion had, and then discussion is, of course, on what is personality and how do you measure personality and how do you optimally measure personality. You have to realize that probably in terms of optimal measurement of personality, a questionnaire approach is one of the most optimal ways of measuring personality, because it's relatively fast, because what you do with every question actually reminds people of instances in which their traits were activated. So instead of having this conversation with you and then you have to think about, okay, is he smiling and is he moving a lot and what does it say about his personality? So are there objective indicators? Every question of a personality questionnaire just pinpoints at some kind of behaviors that people more often exhibit. And so it's an extremely efficient way of finding out about personality of somebody. Basically, within 10 to 20 minutes, remember, within 10 to 20 minutes, you can find out a lot about somebody's personality just by asking these simple questions. So there's no other way of getting to this information anyway that's so efficient as a personality questionnaire. Is it the best way or the most optimal way or the most accurate way? Well, within the time frame, yes. The simple answer is yes. But if you say, well, I would like to know more about somebody, then you have to be together with that person for a very long time. And we know that actually partners are very good in rating the personality on average of their partners. The correlations between partner ratings of somebody that's been in a relationship for a longer period of time and a person, him or herself, is 0.70. This is as high as you, and if you correct that for unreliability, this is as high as you can almost get in psychology. So it's amazing, actually, that using a personality inventory and you get self and other ratings, you get this incredible high level of agreement between self and others if they know each other for a fairly long period of time.
And with the HEXACO model, is it the case that results are consistent over time? That is, if, for example, the same person takes the questionnaire in different points in time, then they get close results? Is that the case?
Yes. So we've actually done that in a period of what was it, 10 years time, and the correlations are also at higher than 0.70 actually. I would have to look it up, but it's approaching 0.80, I believe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in terms of rank ordering, personality is really stable across time. And if you take longer periods of time, McRae has looked at it, I think a period of 30 years or something like that, you get correlation of, what was it, 0.64, I think was the average. So, and of course, this depends whether you take very young children, for instance, the correlations are somewhat lower. If you take around 50 years, my age period, these correlations are fantastically high. But yeah, so very stable, but the rank ordering stays the same, but people do change in their mean level of personality traits. And so, for instance, and here's where also the importance of the HEXACO model comes in, especially on the honesty, humility trait. These changes are the largest among all the dimensions of personality. So you find close to a standard deviation difference between younger people, 18 years old, and older people retiring 65 years old. One standard deviation, a huge difference and so people become more honest and more humble over time, happily.
Okay. So I mean, it's the case then that people personality tends to be consistent throughout the lifespan, but there are some aspects that, at least in some people, change over time.
There are mean-level changes now, so you have the rank ordering fairly consistent across people. So if you see your peers again after 20 years or 30 years, you'll find out that they still, the one who was chaotic 20, 30 years ago is still chaotic, and the one who was very expressive and very extrovert, still very extrovert. So, with respect to compared to yourself, these rank ordings remain the same, but people on average change. So, so there are changes in extroversion, in openness to experience, in emotionality. People become less emotional over time. Some facets more than other facets. In honesty, humility. So in all the personality domains, you find changes over time, but those are mean level changes. Rank stays the same.
But these changes that you're talking about, they occur for people in general, or more specifically for people that have certain personality traits?
There's no evidence that the traits themselves drive trait change. You might suggest, for instance, that openness to experience might drive that, but for so far I know there's no evidence for that. So it's more maturational changes that occur. Once we get older, we find that we change, and some of these changes are with respect to our personality. And that probably has to do also with the evolutionary, that probably has an evolutionary origin. So especially for younger men, especially young men are relatively low on honesty, humility. That would have made evolutionary sense to obtain status, to obtain mates. It would have made sense to not to be fair, and not to be sincere, to be greedy, and not to be modest. And this is especially true for young men. Yeah.
Okay, so let's change topics now and talk a little bit about another part of your work that has to do with communication styles. So, what do you study in that area? What are the types of questions and contexts where you are interested in understanding how people communicate?
Yeah, the question about communication styles came up to me when I worked for some period in a communication science department. And so when I told you before, I was in Australia and I was working together with Kibeom, and when I came back to the Netherlands, I was working at the University of Amsterdam communication science department. So I thought, well, what can I do in this department that's associated with my work, but also relevant for communication science? So I did study a lexical study on communication styles. And I must admit, at first I thought, because there had been some work, that there would be two main dimensions of communication styles. One associated with agency, extraversion, dominance, and the other one associated with affiliation, agreeableness. And so I was actually very surprised to find dimensions, lexical dimensions of communication styles that very much conformed actually to Big Five HEXACO model. And so I created a communication styles inventory, the CSI, that contains 6 dimensions and that are pretty much also aligned to the HEXACO framework. And had each of these dimensions correlates pretty highly, on the top of my head, about 0.60, with each of the respective personality dimensions, except for one dimension, which is preciseness. And preciseness does correlate with conscientiousness, about 0.3 on the top of my head, but is somewhat different. So you can be very precise in your communication, but it may be true that you're not that you are somewhat chaotic, for instance, that you're not very organized or disciplined. So preciseness says something about how you communicate in a to-the-point, concise manner. I'm not sure whether I'm very concise to be, and clear and structured way. Which is somewhat different from conscientiousness. And now, apparently, we found out in studies on leadership that expressiveness, which is closely related to extroversion, and preciseness are the 2 dimensions that are also very important for leadership, for instance. And I would say they are important for all jobs or areas in where you have to communicate a lot with people. So they're probably also important for you and
Yeah,
nice questions to be expressive. Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, and in this area, they have for somebody that's also if you're a teacher, for instance, these two dimensions are very important. And also, if I teach my students, yeah, it's important for me to be precise, but also expressive. So yeah, in these areas, these are very important.
So, could you just tell us about the 6 dimensions? Because I'm sure that most people don't know about it. So,
Yeah, so if I follow the hexaco dimensions, I'm not sure whether people know the hexaco dimensions, but let's say the first one, honesty, humility. The hexaco is an acronym for the 6 hexaco dimensions. So I'll tell the hexaco dimension and the communication style. I call them actually facets because I believe they are also facets of the broader personality domain. So for honesty, humility, you have impression manipulativeness. So I didn't want to call it impression management because there are some inventories that measure impression management and they measure something else. So I called it impression manipulativeness, to manipulate in front of other people the impression that you make on them. So you conceal basically some information, you hide who you are, you are not always sincere in how you communicate, etc. You can also be charming, but had just to ingratiate with other people. So that's an important dimension. And the second dimension is emotionality. Right? Emotionality is the same as emotionality in hexaco dimension, so it also has to do with anxiety in communicating with others and depending on others. And then you have an expressiveness dimension, which is closely related to the extraversion dimension, of course, which also contains aspects related to it's enthusiasm, verbal enthusiasm, also humor and social dominance. Then you have, instead of agreeableness, we call it verbal aggressiveness. So it's actually the reverse of agreeableness. That you can be verbally aggressive, that you can be condemning of other people. And then, so conscientiousness is preciseness but it's less strongly related to conscientiousness than the other are. And then the last one, openness to experience, we call questioningness. So whether you're inquisitive, where you ask questions and are interested in other things, where you're unconventional in your communication, etc., etc. So these dimensions are aligned with the hexaco, but I would call them facets. So the communication styles are basically an expression of your personality, but they are associated with the way you communicate.
Mm-hmm. So you've already referred some examples of occupations where it's important for people to have certain aspects or certain communication styles or dimensions of the communication styles inventory. When it comes to leadership, have you also established a set of traits in terms of communication that it's better for people to have?
Yeah, so as I said, in terms of communication styles, expressiveness and preciseness are the two most important ones. I did also studies on personality and leadership, and you find that leadership dimensions that are very often used, like at initiating structure and consideration and charisma and ethical leadership are closely aligned also with personality dimensions. And it used to be earlier, there was a paper by Judge and Bono who said actually these relations are pretty minimal between personality and leadership styles. But I found out that this was mainly due to what's called the self-other agreement problem. And that is that when you're looking at the work context, people in the work context are somewhat less familiar with personality of other people. So they're less accurate in the ratings of personality, not like partners. The correlation in work context is often only 0.30 instead of 0.60, 0.70 for partners. And this puts a cap on the maximum correlation that you can get if you have, for instance, self-ratings of personality and other ratings of leadership. And I found out if you take this into account, actually the relations are pretty strong. And so leadership is not much more than contextualized personality. And of course, I mean, how could it be something else? I don't understand people that think of something else because it's basically one of the behaviors that you can exhibit. So if you're talking about charisma, it shows enthusiasm. That's part of extroversion. If you're talking about consideration or supportiveness, it has to do with agreeableness. If you're talking about ethical leadership, of course, it has to do with honesty, humility. If you're talking about initiating structure, which is the only one that's somewhat devoid, it's partly also has to do with conscientiousness.
So we're focusing mostly on the workplace now, and we've already talked about the personality traits and the communication styles that are perhaps the best for employers or bosses or leaders to have, right? But when it comes to the other aspect of the workplace that has to do with people that are lower in the hierarchy, workers and employees and people like that, I mean, is there any set of optimal traits that people should have for them to establish good relationships in their workplace with people higher up in the hierarchy and also their co-workers?
Yeah. First of all, let me state that I think the difference between leaders and followers is a sort of superfluous, and I'm investigating that now. So, can you describe followers with the same traits as you can describe leaders? Yes, of course you can, because those are personality traits. But only you find that who emerges as a leader is often a person who is higher on extraversion, for instance. Now, are there traits that are also more optimal maybe for leaders than there are for followers, or I would say other employees? Well, the problem is, of course, that leaders have more effect on the whole, on everything in the organization, on the people and the production and the organization than people that are lower in the hierarchy. So basically, with their traits, they have more effect. So if they're low on conscientiousness or low on honesty, humility, or low on agreeableness, their effect might be substantially worse or much more pronounced than somebody who is lower in the hierarchy. So the same traits that are important for leaders, for employees, are the same traits that are important for leaders, but only leaders have more effect in the organization. And that's why it's so important that we optimally select those people who get a leadership position, because they can have more effect. We should make sure that they do not have the traits that are hurtful for the company and for the employees in the company. And for that, you probably refer to that. I've constructed what I called I've put up an idea of the 3 nightmare traits. And the 3 nightmare traits are low honesty, humility, low conscientiousness, and low agreeableness. So, of course, low conscientiousness, we know conscientiousness is related to all kind of performance measures. So with low conscientiousness, you might have lower performance. With low honesty, humility, there is a higher chance of counterproductive work behaviors, delinquency. So this might have cheating. This might be bad for the company. And with low agreeableness, you might have more chance of conflicts and have clashing relationships and unpleasant work relationship in a group. We know that people have the lowest person in a group, with the person with the lowest agreeableness in a group has the most impact on things like the satisfaction of the group members with the group. So these three traits, especially the low levels, are very important. And if that is combined with high extroversion, and somebody is able to get in a leadership position, yes, you can have a sort of nightmare organization if some of those people become a CEO. Yeah.
So those three traits, that is low conscientiousness, low honesty, humility, and low agreeableness, are the ones that you know that have the biggest negative effects on people's performance in the workplace.
Yes, so people that are characterized with the traits, you have a higher chance. I mean, it never says we only deal with population statistics. I won't say anything about any individual here, but yes, you have a higher chance of having negative outcomes, work performance outcomes, delinquency outcomes, and group satisfaction outcomes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this has to do both with how people perform their tasks and also with how they establish relationships with the other people at work.
Right? Yeah, right. Yeah. So, for instance, authoritarian leadership, which is associated with low agreeableness and also low honesty, humility, has very negative effects on subordinates, on the employees, for instance. And we know there's a lot of research out there that people feel dissatisfied and unhappy with the work circumstance. So, those people can have a huge effect. Yeah.
And do you know if this happens cross-culturally or not?
Of course, most of the studies are done in the weird cultures. I cannot actually say on all the cultures because we haven't investigated them, but my bet would be that yes, this is true for all cultures that would be investigated. That these kind of people have negative effects on other people in all cultures. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And these traits, I mean, they don't have directly to do with different styles of leadership. So, for example, those traits would also be important in situations where people prefer a more authoritarian style of leadership, and also others where they maybe prefer a more liberal leader or one that allows for their employees to more directly communicate with them and things like that.
You have to realize one thing, and if you look at political leadership, that's of course another thing. So I'm talking about a work setting where you directly work with your. So people might actually vote for an authoritarian leader to get things done. Let me give you, for instance, a personal example about low agreeableness and why it might be very functional sometimes. I once went to a concert in which I was with a friend, and there was a parking space. It was a huge concert. How many people? Well, I think there were something like 40,000 people, huge concert. A parking place in the downstairs, huge parking, and some of those exits were blocked because they were working on those exits. So there was actually only one exit available. 40,000 people, something like 10,000 cars had to get out at this one exit. You can understand what kind of queue you got. So after 1.5 hours, I walked out the car to find out what was happening. I went to the place where they opened the gate. And so I was standing there and I was seeing, okay, only 2 cars were passing every 10 seconds. Only 2. Because they had to pull in the strip and the gate had to open, car had to go out. 2 per 10 seconds. So I was counting. And I was counting, it would take something like 5 hours to get all the cars out. So there was a guy standing there. I said, hey, come on, I've calculated this. It will take 5 hours for all the cars to get out. Please open the gate and just take the tickets like this, and then things will go faster. So I was telling this very nicely. Of course, he said, no, I cannot do this. My boss prohibits me. So I walked back and I said this to other people who were standing out. Some of those people got so mad, they got furious when I said this. So they walked to the gate and they become very threatening and said, if you don't open the gate, I'll hit you. And they become very angry. And what happened? Of course, the gate went open. So being agreeable doesn't work sometimes. Being disagreeable really has an effect. And so people vote for a political leader who can be disagreeable to get things done, things that they couldn't do themselves. And that's why we find some disagreeable leaders in the world, because it's not, people wouldn't like to work with that person, maybe only for the status, because they get fired or they get into a conflict. And this is what happens all the time in politics with disagreeable leaders and dishonest leaders. And so people don't want to work with him, but they want to vote for him.
Okay, so let me just ask you one last question that still has to do with the workplace and the communication styles and personality traits that work the best for employers and employees. I mean, what can people do with this kind of knowledge? Do you think that it could be best applied in trying to understand how people should choose as their leaders and as their employees? Or do you think that it could also be used to change how people that are already part of a company interact with one another?
Yeah, actually both. Of course, the most important application is in selection situations. So cognitive ability, of course, is one of the most important predictor of work outcomes, but personality as well. So personality has been used in companies for selection purposes. And also to look at whether people fit, for instance, in teams, although personality is less relevant than, for instance, values are, although values, again, are related to personality. So, but, yeah, we do find that people, if they get informed about their personality, that they might like to change. Not everybody wants to change, but without knowledge about your own personality, it's impossible to know, of course, what you would like to change, and maybe also how you can change. So I think this is an important start. And there is some evidence, actually, that asking first people about their personality and making them aware of their personality, and then asking whether they would like to change and how they would change, that this indeed can lead to change. So it can motivate people to change their personality. But changing personality is not a very easy thing. It's a long-term commitment. And most of the time people change only to small degrees. People already naturally change. So, but yeah, I generally think that knowing about personality is also good for people, because it makes them aware of who they are, how they interact with people, what certain problems in their interaction might be, and whether they should change or whether they want to change. So yeah, I think, but the main purpose that it is used for is most of the time in selection situation. Yeah, simple. Yeah.
And those changes that you're talking about when people know about their personalities, for example, do you know if people are able to do them alone just by being motivated, or if they always need some sort of help, like, for example, by a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, there have been some programs. I'm not familiar with the work, whether you're familiar with the work of Hudson, and he does studies on personality change and also had directed personality change, or what he called volitional personality change, so change that people want to make. And you find that actually, yeah, if you're very specific, so global recommendations about change this personality traits work less well than very specific guided steps of change. And this is true, of course, with feedback. Yeah, we know the whole feedback literature. So this is also true of personality. So guided, specific, focus on specific behaviors works better than a sort of global feedback. Hey, please change your personality.
Yeah, I imagine. Okay, so Dr. De Vries, let's end the interview here. But before we go, what are the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
Oh, just take a look at Google Scholar and then type in my name. So Reinout de Vries. There are more Reinout de Vries on in the Netherlands, but on Google Scholar, I believe until now there's only one. Yeah, and you find my work, so you can take a look at what I do. Yeah.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview for people to go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. De Vries, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. It's nice meeting you and nice being on your show, and thanks everybody for listening. Yeah.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also support me on PayPal or Subscribestar. All of the links are in the description box of the interview. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Dias, Dr. Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, and also my 3 producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.